welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Melissa Lott, and I'm a senior research scholar here at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, where I lead the center's Power Sector and Renewables Research Initiative. Today, we're going to discuss the transition to low and zero carbon power in the United States. Let me first quickly say that this event is being broadcast or webcast live, and the full video will be available on the Center on Global Energy Policy website in the coming days. For those of you who are joining us via Zoom, you will be able to submit questions for the panelists at any time. You just need to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And for those of you who are watching the live stream anywhere else, you can always submit a question to us via Twitter using the hashtag CGEPLive and our Twitter handle @ColumbiaUEnergy. Now, before we get started, I would like to ask that each of you take a moment to answer a quick polling question, which I will ask our events team led by Ms. Caitlin Norfleet to bring up now if we can. And we'll be using the results of this poll during our discussion. Again, if you're viewing the live stream anywhere else except for the Zoom platform, please do feel free to respond via Twitter. We will keep an eye out for your responses there. For today's event, we're going to be joined by 4 excellent speakers who bring many decades of experience working in the power sector and whose bios you can find online in full. First, we'll have Dr. Peter Fox-Penner, then Mr. David Hill, Richard Kaufman, and Cheryl LaFleur speaking with us today. And I dare say to many of you who work in the area, these are household names. I certainly feel lucky working at the Center on Global Energy Policy to have 3 of these people in my team working on various aspects of the Power Sector Renewables Research Initiative. Whether you read the book Smart Power when it came out in 2010 or its sequel Power After Carbon that came out earlier this year, if you're engaged in the current discussion on the design of our wholesale power markets, if you follow the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission FERC's activities over the past decade, or you follow the sector leading efforts in New York State's Reforming the Energy Vision initiatives, these are faces and names you've seen, and I'm really excited to have them with us today to discuss this topic. Before we get started with Peter's presentation, I'm going to turn things over to Jason Bordoff, who's our founding director of the Center on Global Energy Policy, and he'll be making some introductory remarks. So with that, Jason, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Melissa. So I just want to welcome everyone to this really distinguished group. I'm interested to see the results of that poll. Apparently, the host and the panelists can't vote on the poll, so I didn't get to vote. I have strong views on what the right answer is, but I'm curious to hear what everyone else thinks, and mostly to hear what our panelists have to say. David and Richard and Cheryl and Melissa, it's extraordinary to have all of you as colleagues to work with. And then Peter, the book is tremendous. It's right here sitting on my desk. And it was great to do a podcast with you recently and talk about it. So thank you for joining us to do that. Peter and really all of the panelists you're going to hear from today have probably forgotten more about how to decarbonize the power sector than I'll ever know. So I'm mostly here to learn and listen to all of them. It's going to be a really engaging and informative conversation, and really couldn't be a more important topic. We know that climate change is one of the defining challenges of our time. It's already impacting negatively on our health and our communities, and there's not much time left to start moving in a direction of much more rapidly decarbonizing to come anywhere close to meeting targets like 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius temperature stabilization. A key to that, it is clear, is going to be electrification and decarbonization. We're going to need to electrify things that are not electrified today, and then we're going to need to decarbonize not just the sum total of the electricity we are using and generating today, but more, because we're going to be electrifying more things. So the power sector is already in the midst of a pretty rapid transition. Coal was about half of our electricity here in the US at the turn of the century. You fast forward to today and it's less than a quarter. Still, about 2/3 of the electricity is coming from hydrocarbons, mostly natural gas, some coal as well. Nuclear is still about 20% of our mix, and the rest renewables, mostly hydro, although we're certainly seeing solar and wind grow enormously, and the costs have fallen dramatically, as well as the costs of at least short-term energy storage solutions. So then the question coming to that polling question is what's standing in the way of moving much more rapidly to decarbonize the power grid? And so we don't yet have comprehensive federal climate policy. This transition has been supported nonetheless by state and local action, and by private sector action. And we're going to hear Peter talk about that a little bit. So the power sector is transitioning, but clearly not fast enough. And that sort of means reaching net neutrality on emissions, as Vice President Biden just pledged to do by 2035 in his plan, is going to need that we need to build zero carbon supply much faster. We're going to need to invest in our grid and modernizing our grid. And we're going to need to think about regulatory reforms at the state, local, as well as federal level. Peter, as Melissa said, wrote Smart Power about a decade ago, and it was sort of a defining book at that time to understand all of those challenges. And then this year, his sequel, Power After Carbon, goes really in great detail and depth into how we drive toward lower and lower carbon sources of energy in the electricity system, how we make sense of all the different moving parts across supply, the power grid, the demand side of the equation, and then with all of these changes, how we can set up the power sector so it can deliver our goal, which is abundant, affordable, secure, flexible, and low carbon and electricity all at the same time. So that is a daunting set of challenges, and I really can't imagine anyone better to speak to it than Peter and my colleagues from the Center on Global Energy Policy. So it's a pleasure to be with all of you. Thanks to all of you for joining us for this webinar. With that, let me turn it over, Peter, to you.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for that intro. And to all of you at the Center for Global Energy Policy, who I have considered as colleagues long before the center even was a gleam in Jason's eye. And what a gleam it was. It's been a pleasure to be your colleague. And I must say, I have done many, many book talks, and you would have to go back a long, long way, perhaps all the way, to find as distinguished and qualified a panel to talk about the topics of the book. So I'm not just buttering you guys up. All you panelists are my friends from way back. This is a fantastic group, and as a result, I'm giving the shortest presentation I've ever tried to attempt in order to get your reactions to what I have in the book, and really a discussion amongst ourselves, as we did in the prep for this call, which was fantastic. So without further ado, I'm going to try and share my screen and blast through these slides. Apologies to all of you in the audience for the fire hose nature of this. Hopefully it's an inducement to buy the book, or at least look at some of the other podcasts and webcasts, including the one that I did with Jason. That was very, very interesting. So let me try and do this and not screw it up. You guys see that? Yes? All right. Let's see if I can get the slides to advance now. Let's see if I can do that. Whoops, hold it. Okay. The first part of the book is about electricity's role in the climate solution, and all of you understand, I think, or many of you, that there's a big consensus in climate policy now that for the developed world in particular, the pillars of a energy climate policy, putting aside agriculture and some other aspects of the climate problem, the energy part of it has 5 pillars, if you will: accelerating energy efficiency, which is always the first fuel; electrifying most transportation. That it is clear that pathway has enormous promise. Look at Tesla and Rivian and just incredible progress we're making there. We agree that there's great progress to be made in electrifying building heat and backing us out of fossil-based heat sources. And then there is also tremendous promise in electrifying industrial processes as a means of decarbonizing them. It isn't the only way we'll decarbonize industry, but it is one critical way. If you add all of this up, unless the energy efficiency offsets the other 3 pillars, you're going to need even more power than you have, in addition to the fact that you need to decarbonize the current power system. So the first part of the book is all about kind of weighing how much more power we're going to need vis-a-vis how much we can get from energy efficiency, or will get from energy efficiency, and also what the role of these new uses will be in order to figure out how big a grid decarbonization question do we have. And I use this figure to illustrate sort of the push and pull of energy demand, or electricity demand, as I call it. You see the vertical axis on this is electricity sales, and one X is our current sale, which is about 3,900 terawatt hours here in the United States. Electricity use is always pushed up by GDP and population growth in the absence of other things that offset it, namely our energy efficiency policies, which I label, compared to their potential, as relatively weak in this country. But they have been strong enough to offset electricity demand growth for at least the past decade, which is remarkable. It's the first time that's ever happened. Electricity prices have been stable. This is not a price-induced reduction in electric use. Prices are very, very useful signal in reducing electricity demand. We just haven't had them in the last 10 years, but we have had energy efficiency policies, secular and intentional, enough to offset growth. With strong policies, we can take electricity demand below current levels, and in some places we have forecasts where that's happening. But the question was posed by the book for all of us who care about climate policy: when you add in the new electric uses for transportation, for industry, for heating, how much more are you going to bring electricity back above its current use? And for that, we can look at some deep decarbonization studies, most of them now 5 years old or longer. It's weird that there was a big interest in doing this about 3 to 5 years ago. Many of you were involved in these studies. You can get the book to see the citations to all these studies. But once again, the vertical axis is, one is sales in, now this is now sales in 2050 as a multiple of today's use, as predicted by these deep decarbonization studies. And most of them in these studies straddle one, which says that energy electrification, demand growth from electrification, and all those three pillars has been almost fully offset by strong energy efficiency policies. The energy efficiency policies in these deep decarbonization studies are very, very strong. The electrification compared to, I think, what we need is weak. And as a result, my own conclusion, and you can read about it in the book, is that the studies that are the few studies that are in 1.5 to 2 are the right ones. I think that's where we'll be, and we may even need to be above that. That sets an important frame around this. We're going to need a power industry, I think, about half again as large as we have. Maybe as large as double. If you take all of current uses, you account for the greater efficiency that electrification brings, and you apply it to every single BTU of energy use in the United States, you about double electricity use. You can see that calculation in the book too. So I think the answer is somewhere 1.5 and 2. If we do a lot of electrification for hydrogen, that'll be more. And if we use electricity to do direct carbon extraction from the atmosphere, that will be more still. I think 1.5 to 2 is a safe bet. What that says is we have a big job ahead of us, but that amount of growth in the size of the power grid in 30 years is very, very manageable. The power industry, in fact, has grown that fast. During the 40s and 50s and 60s, it grew almost exactly that fast. So we know we can do that, but it's not easy and it takes planning. Which takes us to the next section of the book about the big grid. We're not going to be able to get that much electricity from distributed sources. I won't belabor that. You can read all about it in the book. Distributed sources are very, very important, but we're going to need an expanded wholesale or large bulk power grid, as we want to call it. And there's no surprises here. It's going to come from these resources: wind, solar, PV. I think advanced nuclear will play a role. I hope it will. And certainly current nuclear is playing, as Jason mentioned, 20% of our supply at zero carbon role. Gas with CCS, I think, is coming along strongly. CGEP's a leader in this space with Julio Friedman, as many of you know. And that's coming along. There's lots of other sources that I think will contribute less. And then there's some very, very important balancing resources, large-scale storage, flexible load, and the grid itself, which are really, I think, far and away the most important and difficult part of achieving a decarbonized grid. And that is absolutely a theme of the book. If there's nothing else you take away from this talk, please take that away. And to hammer that home, I have 4 takeaways on what needs to be done to make the big grid decarbonize at the pace we need to. And most of these are not going to be news to any of you. In fact, many of you know more about this than me or any of us panelists. But first of all, we need more large-scale storage, and we're talking about terawatt-scale storage. The seasonal energy in PJM is 234 terawatt hours. That is the amount that is used in one season and will have to be generated in another, or the seasonal shift in demand, if you will. And that's true in many, many systems around the world. We are installing current storage at gigawatt scales. That's great. It's much, much larger than it's ever been done. But we will need a 1,000x increase in storage or the equivalent, and we'll get to that. That argues for continued R&D and diversification. There's great new storage technologies, pump storage of all types, and flow batteries and many other things under development. That needs to continue. We'll probably continue to need hydro and rely on it. So that's one important element. Demand response, or flexible load, as we now call it, is really, really critical. Several calculations, including those of my colleagues at Energy Impact Partners and Brattle Group, independently conclude that flexible load resource in the United States is on the order of 200 gigawatts. That's 1/5 of our current grid. That's an enormous, very valuable resource. It's not a good seasonal storage resource. It's a super critical day or multi-day storage resource. And we need to tap that. To do that, we need market and regulatory reforms, just like FERC Order 841, that I'm sure Cheryl can tell us quite a bit about, that allows storage to be aggregated and used, but also large-scale storage aggregation and more refined product definition and markets for refined value-stacked ancillary service products in the bulk power markets. Transmission is particularly, I think, underplanned and underbuilt in the United States. And that leads to the next 2 slides, so I won't belabor that now. And then finally, financial mechanisms for the big grid facility. They're really good, they're sophisticated. They will also benefit from the reform of power markets and creating more value streams. That work is underway with many of you doing the hard work of revising the many bulk power markets and RTO markets around the United States, as well as in Europe, Australia, Japan, and other places. And all that work is critical. But I want to focus a little bit on transmission and planning, which I think isn't talked about enough. And to contrast what I say in the book, I'm going to very briefly contrast it with what is said in the new Solving the Climate Crisis House Select Committee report. When they talk about grid planning and grid expansion, here's what they say to do. Modernize the National Interest Electric Transmission Corridors Program, establish, quote, a national policy on transmission, improve cost allocation into regional planning, and consider macro RTOs to do planning and cost allocation. I think these are interesting ideas, and they're all pretty good ideas. I think they're good ideas, and I don't think they're sufficient. There is not enough oomph behind them. And maybe I'm wrong, because I commit the heresy in the book of suggesting a regional energy planning requirement that would be enforced on states who have to form regional compacts or regional energy planning groups, if you will, and require them to do zero net carbon energy plans, not just for electricity, but also factoring in decarbonization of other industries. And the reason I do that is because there's going to be extremely strong interactions between decarbonizing heat and transportation and industry, either through using electricity or through using decarbonized other fuels, or by trading fuels such as making hydrogen and then turning it into electricity, or vice versa. And to pull all that off, you will need infrastructure, not just transmission grid, but also hydrogen infrastructure. And in my experience, markets are fantastic at bringing forth generating plants and demand side solutions. They have not kept up with building transmission in an era where our capital stock turnover has been very, very mild in the electricity industry compared to the extremely rapid recreation of the generating base of the industry and also the consumption base of the industry. And the transmission grid, as well as a potential future hydrogen grid and other things, need to be, in my experience, planned and financed and supported by government policy, not just with something stronger than Congress expressing a policy. So I'll leave it to the panel to comment on these things. We had a good discussion before, and I welcome everybody's feedback on this. I recognize it's a somewhere between a heavy lift and a heresy, but I do think it's worth discussing as a missing link in decarbonizing the power system. Finally, very briefly, on the third part of the book is about the downstream or retail sector. That's where distribution utilities live, the so-called utility of the future discussion. We know that distribution utilities are facing many pressures. In the short run, they've had low to negative kilowatt hour deliveries, including under the pandemic, where sales are down 8%, revenues are down almost that much, if not more in some places. That puts revenue pressure on the utilities. At the same time, they have to increase capital expenditures because as more electric vehicles are added and rooftop solar systems are added and intelligence solutions are available to customers with much greater control, they've got to put in much more sophisticated management systems in their distribution grids. And that takes hardware and software and new operating systems, new methods of planning, and new CapEx, of course. There's a much more demanding operating environment going on for distribution utilities. Customers are ever more reliant on electric power, as we are at this very moment for virtually all of our interactions with each other, all of our commerce. There's an increase in severe weather events. I usually show slides on that, and we all know how that has affected reliability. And customer service expectations, even outside of these things, have gotten stronger as people are used to 24/7 service on apps on their phones. So all of these are pressures on utilities. And then finally, to top it off, there is risk of fragmentation and customer defection. I don't think it's extremely large in the wholesale customer defection realm. I think most people will stay connected to the grid, but they will use the grid less. And in particular, microgrids could really create some fragmentation issues just at a time when the grid should really operate as an integrated whole all the way down from the IoT devices in your washing machine, all the way through the transmission system to all the CCS and hydro and wind and solar facilities. So these are the pressures on distribution utilities. There's a continuation of the discussion in my, let's see if I can get back there, in the book. The same business models as I talked about before, and I'll just mention the two dominant models. One is the smart integrator or the platform utility. You can see as a homage to Richard Kaufman, who I had the joy of working with on the Rev docket, that I put New York there as one of the pioneers in its vision of utilities as platforms for joining a rich ecosystem of energy service providers with customers. That's also the EU's vision. Over on the right, the other kind of canonical version is where utilities integrate more into those services and provide kind of complete holistic energy services assistance and price their services accordingly. I'll just say briefly that I see both of these models continue to be popular. I don't see one dominating ever. I see both of them advancing day by day, year by year, with the support and the wisdom of public service commissions. And in particular, most of all, in between them in green, you see hybrids. That nobody I know is a absolutely pure smart integrator or a pure energy service utility, and that's okay. Performance-based regulation is an essential part of the equation. In the interest of getting to their conversation, I won't go through. You can see its use is growing here. Its use is growing in Europe. There's no other way I can see to modify current cost of service regulation to meet the challenges that you see distribution utilities having and that we all have in decarbonizing the grid. On the other hand, I think PRBR is perfectly capable of doing it. We just need to configure the business model and the form of regulation to marry up and give utilities the right incentives to earn enough money to do what they need to do efficiently and effectively. So as a quick shout out to Electrification and the groups that are working on it. We can talk about them in the conversation section if you'd like to. There's a number of groups doing really good work on this, and more of them. Half these folks didn't exist a year ago. And so to summarize very quickly, a completely clean power industry, 50% or more or larger than today, is necessary. I think it's very achievable. Maximize energy efficiency, do PBR in the downstream sector, and figure out the business model that you're driving towards. It's not easy. It's a very dense section of my book that could give you a headache. It gave me headaches, to be honest, but it's a lot of hard shoveling, but it's doable. Decarbonizing big grids needs storage, regional planning, the heresy, and reformed markets, which are underway. We need cost-effective electrification of the end-use verticals. And I think this will take us 15, 20 years. It shouldn't take us longer, and it need not. And with that, I want to say thank you. There's a lot of acknowledgements here to people who helped on this. I thank you all for your attention. I'm honored to be here, and I'm really looking forward to hear what the panelists and all of you in the audience have to say. So thanks.
Well, thank you both Jason for your introductory comments and to Peter for that presentation. Very quickly, before I turn it over to our respondents, I wanted to share, if I could ask Caitlin if we could share the results of our first polling question, if everyone can see this. I won't ask at this moment because I know we're going to move on to our other folks on this panel and hear from them. But the clear #1 response with 42% of the votes for the people who were here at the onset of this discussion was that the biggest barrier to decarbonizing the power grid is the lack of comprehensive federal policy, followed by regulatory structures and macro design. And I'll say the third and fourth, which was essentially a tie, revolve around technology. So certainly I'm feeling good about this because it reinforces a lot of the questions we're going into. And Peter, what do you want to say? Yeah.
Can I say a sad but wonderful thing?
Yep.
Sadly, you folks may not need to buy the book because this is exactly the profile that emerges from the book, and the reason why I talked about my heresy of federally mandated energy planning. But kudos to all of you, and thank you.
I appreciate it. And then I would like to, now that we've seen those results, if we could quickly bring up the second question, which Peter hit on right at the end of his presentation, talking about the timeline for doing all of this. So when we go to our second question on our poll, which we'll bring up. So if we want to successfully decarbonize the economy, so this is an economy-wide question, in order to mitigate the impacts of climate change, under that assumption, how quickly do we need to decarbonize the power sector?
While people are answering that, I'm going to hold up the book again and tell them they should buy it, notwithstanding this webinar.
You know, it's excellent. I actually pulled Peter's Smart Power off of my my bookshelf and re-thumbed through it. I remember reading it when it first came out. So fantastic. All right, so as we move beyond the second poll, and thank you again for responding. As a reminder, just very quickly, for those of you who are logged into Zoom, please feel free to go ahead and start sending questions. We're going to put those into the discussion later on. And if you're not on Zoom, if you're watching the live stream anywhere else, please go ahead and via Twitter, use the hashtag CJEPLive, and then our Twitter handle @ColumbiaUEnergy to submit your questions. Thank you to everyone. For the next portion of this event, I'm going to hand things over to 3 discussants, all of whom are distinguished scholars here at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, and a significant portion of why I'm so excited to come to work every day to have discussions with these 2 folks. First up, we're going to hear from Ms. Cheryl LaFleur with her initial comments in response to Peter's presentation.
Thanks very much, Melissa, and congratulations on your book, Peter. I got a lot of traffic on Twitter when I said that it was my beach reading, and I just want to point out, if I can do this with this fake screen, that the color of your book really is exactly like most of the other beach books this summer. So you properly positioned it for the summer blockbuster market. You wrote a whole book. I only wrote a couple pages here, but mostly in agreement with you, although I might prioritize the problems a little differently. I certainly agree that decarbonization of the US electricity sector, which we need to do before we can start the other sectors well, is going to require changes on the big grid and the small grid. I'm going to talk mostly about the big grid. I'm a big grid gal. I think Richard's going to talk mostly about the small grid. I start from the premise that I strongly believe that the US has achieved far less decarbonization than we're capable of, given our financial, technical, and natural resources. And it's, in my opinion, and I think as shown by the poll, because of several really big systemic issues. And the first one, and the poll winner, was the lack of a national consensus that climate change is a problem, and thus the lack of a strategy or goal. So quite simply, if you're not trying to do something, it should be no surprise that you're not getting maximum success. The second, though, I think, is the disaggregated decision-making between the different federal agencies, between federal, state, and local government, all pursuing policies that are sometimes working at cross purposes. And in particular, a lot of different people have a say over what gets built, where it gets built, and who pays for it. And finally, I think there's a mismatch that's a profound problem between people's expressed support for climate action and their willingness to do something about it. And I don't mean just not using plastic straws, but allowing resources, whether they're utility scale renewables or transmission to connect renewables, to be built near them, which is a problem you discuss in a chapter in your book. I agree with your book that one of the more difficult problems we're going to have is developing good, cost-effective, carbon-free balancing resources to balance renewables, which are mostly intermittent, for that last 20–25% of power, for the seasonal balancing. But I don't want to say I disagree, but I would say that even developing the large-scale wind and solar, that's supposed to be the easier part than the balancing resources, which can obviously be balanced with existing natural gas, and we'd save a ton of carbon by doing that, is far from easy. Right now, there's a lot of investment money. I know that the Biden Energy Plan and others have supported putting a lot of money into infrastructure, and that can only be good, but there's a lot of private investment money seeking to build offshore wind, onshore wind, utility scale solar, pumped hydro, and transmission to connect it. But getting those projects sited and built is very difficult. I agree that we should modernize the national interest electric transmission corridors, and I've testified several times that Congress should amend Section 216 to make backstop siting actually workable, but I don't think those things are enough. Your book recommends improved cost allocation and interregional planning for transmission. That rang a bell with me because those are the exact words of FERC Order number 1000, which is 9 years old, which was, we spent years writing, doing compliance cases, getting approved by multiple courts, but it has been very, very little utilized in practice, particularly states agreeing on the allocation of costs for public policy resources, and also the introduction of competitive transmission processes. As far as your recommendation of regional energy planning groups, thinking of how hard it was to get utilities to commit to the Order 1000 transmission planning groups, I would say if Congress wants to require regional planning, we should make use of existing regional structures that already exist and do some things well. The regional transmission organizations, the regional markets, the Order 1000 regional transmission planning regions, which they just merged a few of them out west, a couple of them out west, and entities like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel with structures. What we need is to somehow put in place an imperative that'll require people to go through the hard work of states with siting authority over facilities and transmission actually working together, either to implement national targets, which will be easier, or to rationalize their individual state targets into something that's mutually beneficial. And that'll allow the utilization of resources across a broader geography, because if we expect the states, some of which are quite geographically small, to solve decarbonization within their boundaries, we're making it much, much harder than it needs to be. The big grid is a lot bigger than that. I agree with your recommendation, which is now as unanimous of everyone who's ever looked at this, that carbon valuation, either pricing carbon through the markets, setting a national cap and trade would be the optimal way to get where we need to get in the most cost-effective way. I think that's a political heavy lift, but I think it's something to still try for again in the new administration if there is one. In short, I agree with most of what's in your book, but I think I would put a heavier emphasis, not just on the policy, but on the implementation of people actually agreeing and building things and educating the public on the importance of that. I think to meet the challenge of the future, we need to agree that we want to meet the challenge, at least get some consensus, develop solutions over as broad a geography as we can, but then actually move forward to implement those solutions. And your book pointed a lot of the way, and I think it was great beach reading. I recommend it to anyone on the call who hasn't picked it up so far. I bought it right on Amazon, but I don't know whether the link you gave was better in some way. But thanks very much. Look forward to the questions and the discussion.
Thanks, Cheryl. Appreciate your comments. Next up, we're going to hear from Richard Kaufman. So Richard, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Melissa. And thank you, Peter, for your book and for your thought leadership and for your work with us in New York State on REV. And Peter, I love you like a brother, but there are three topics which on the small grid, which you touched on, where I believe requires further discussion, and I'm frankly not sure where I agree with you. I think the first topic is how much of the remaking of the grid can be done through market forces and how much has to be done through regulatory fiat. And when I talk about market forces, I'm not talking about what I'll characterize as FERC-like wholesale market structures, which are quite anachronistic to the power sector. And I'm talking about market forces that exist elsewhere in the economy, because the power sector, and I'm going to come to this in a second, really has acted as has been in a kind of bubble away from forces that have taken place in other sectors of the economy. So, I know it's an overused and an imperfect analogy, but the rebuilding of the telephony system was not done by government determining the number of modems or switches. Government established broad rules and let market actors figure out how to allocate the capital. So in the power sector now, we have storage and renewable mandates, but those just bolt onto a grid architecture that wasn't designed for those resources. When you talk about energy efficiency or demand response, these aren't businesses for the utilities. These are matters of regulatory compliance. These are activities that the utilities have to do because regulators tell them to do it. So I'm not saying the markets can do everything, but we need to figure out what can be done better by markets and what through regulation. I think the second topic is this role of the distribution utility in the business model. And you said that the sort of rate-based approach to compensation and regulation is probably not going to go away very much. It can be tinkered with PBR. But I think we need to recognize that that the rate-based approach to compensation has built a system which is energy and financially or capital really inefficient. New York State, for example, has average capacity utilization of the system, which is 54%, built for the hottest hours or days of the year. And, you know, there were arguments for that a long time ago in terms of technology, but there's been a revolution in other capital intensive industries away from the regulated power sector in the last 35 or 40 years due to the imperatives of global competition. And so these industries now operate at 85 or 90% average capacity utilization. So that really represents, just in New York, if we could get to that level, billions of dollars a year that could be invested in the system or save customers money. And these were changes that came about from adoption of new technology, changes in financial incentives, and changes in business model. And really the regulated sector has been protected from these forces that have been going on in other capital intensive industries. So it does raise the question of the role of the distribution utility. You know, I think, again, my own perspective here in New York is that the utility should be a system integrator, paid for the capital it deploys, but also being paid for capital deployed by third parties. And that's what Cheryl said. There's plenty of capital that is on the sidelines that is ready to be deployed even in the little grid. And the obstacle is not cost. The obstacle, because the system is so financially inefficient, it's opening up the system that will permit the utilities to engage with lesser cost alternatives. So in terms of PBR, you know, my issues there is that still puts the regulator at the center, still creates a dynamic where the regulated business tries to figure out, you know, how to maximize its business based upon what the regulator wants. Utilities are going to be worried the PBR can be changed in the future. You know, it's not very much like the way that other businesses operate. And I think we should try to figure out how to open up utilities to the processes that have been going on around them and strip things away rather than trying to figure out how to reinvent the regulator for what we want to try to accomplish. And that takes us to the third point, which is the role of the state regulator. And, you know, we just have to recognize that the process right now is not operating at a speed that's required for the problem at hand. It also deters innovation. Innovative companies can't stick it out through the regulatory process of building the record. The regulators at a disadvantage when it comes to dealing with utilities from information asymmetry standpoint and from you know, the trump card. Sorry, wrong word. The fear that there'll be system failure. So it still often comes down to bilateral negotiation between the regulator and the utility when it comes to rate cases and capital allocation. And so I think, again, this is a question of whether processes can be opened up. And you talk about system planning, and, you know, we're in an open source world in other parts of the economy. And the question is whether or not we can have more open source processes when it comes to systems planning that allow many market actors to weigh in so that the regulator can become more of a market monitor rather than trying to be the arbiter of truth. And so just last point I would make, we know in New York State from the non-wires alternatives that a system is so inefficient that it is possible to do capital planning and deploy more innovative technology that's cleaner in locations where that makes sense, to compensate utilities based upon a share of savings. And so the question is whether utilities can take that same idea from 15% of the customer bill, which is capital, to almost 50% of the bill, which is the power portion, which would turn energy efficiency into a business. And so just the last point then is, you know, we can certainly build the system of the future if we want under your model where it's an integrated model, but I fear that it will be very, very expensive. I fear that it will be inequitable, and I fear that it will not bring about the innovation that will give the country an opportunity to build whole new industry.
Thank you, Richard, for that. And after we hear from our last speaker, Peter, I will plan to pass it back to you. So if you are, I don't know if you're writing down thoughts in response to this, we can just start the discussion off with that. But for now, I'm going to pass things over to David Hill. And David, if you don't mind, I'll flag before I pass it to you that David leads some of our work around a partnership with Johns Hopkins University called the Future Power Markets Forum, though of course Cheryl and Richard are involved as well. But thank you, David. I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Melissa, and thank you, Peter and Cheryl and Richard and Jason. It's a great pleasure for me to have such great colleagues at the center at Columbia University. So I'll try to make my comments brief here. First of all, and I will follow up on a couple of the things that Cheryl and Richard both said, and that I strongly agree with. But let me just start by first of all saying I thought it was interesting that that 42% of the respondents on the poll said that the lack of a comprehensive federal policy was the biggest problem here. I have to say I'm a skeptic of grand master plans, and I think it is a mistake to hold our breath and wait for them, or to use that as the reason why we're not doing other things, or to think that waiting on that is a good idea, or that we think that will solve our problems. I personally I don't see the point in waiting on that, and I think we could well be waiting on it forever. I think instead, there are so many tools that we already have and that we have available, some of which we haven't really honestly even tried to use here, in terms of coming up with the least cost, fastest, most effective way of solving some of the problems we're talking about. You know, Richard touched upon this in terms of talking about markets and market solutions to some of our problems. I strongly agree with that. I think that market solutions, and looking at market solutions for what it is that we can come up with and how it is that we can solve a lot of our problems is the best way to do it. I will say there in the New York ISO, we're trying to put forward a carbon pricing initiative as a part of the ISO's program, and of course, it's we're trying to slog through what it is that it takes to get the support for that and to make it happen. And it's hard, but I think it has great potential to accomplish a lot. And I think of course, FERC is having its carbon pricing conference in September. There's a lot that could be done with existing authority. Waiting for Congress or to pass laws or to do something else that is something out there. We should not wait on that. There is too much to be done so much faster. And so anyway, I really think that we have to look at all of the market way, including competitive transmission. I think that some of our the efforts at sort of regulatory directed command and control solutions are oftentimes a pathway to stranded costs. I think we need to go back, and we really need to think back on why is it that we opened the transmission system? Why is it we brought about competitive markets in the wholesale power markets to begin with back in the 90s? There are reasons why that was done. There are problems that was meant to solve. Was it a complete success? No, but I think that one thing we've really got to be careful now as we work on decarbonizing is not making some of the same mistakes that were made in the past, and that led to enormous stranded costs in a number of cases. Second point I'll make just briefly is, and one of the points that Peter touched upon in his slides and also in the book, and that I think a lot more effort and attention needs to be focused on, is transportation electrification. For all that we talk about in terms of the power grid and decarbonizing decarbonating, maybe that would be a new word, decarbonizing the electric power system, it's still worth keeping in mind that that the total energy use of the country is 80% fossil, 80% fossil today. With the largest part of the remainder, of course, if you count hydro and nuclear, that's more than half of the remaining 20%. For the 80% that's all fossil, the petroleum is by far the biggest part of that. Petroleum is more than a third of the entire energy consumption of the United States. And of course, we know where most of that is. It's in transportation. And so I think transportation electrification has such great potential for decarbonizing and for reducing our carbon footprint. And yet that's a very tough set of problems. And I think that a lot more attention could be productively focused on that. Finally, I'll just mention briefly some of the comments Richard was making about on the energy services utility and the smart integrator front. I really think that's one of the most interesting parts of your book, Peter. And I think what is going on the distribution side of things, the lack of innovation on really the consumer side of the electric business is really kind of amazing. I think there is and sometimes people will ask me, well, what do you think what do you think can be innovated? Look, if I knew what could be innovated, I would have already done it. I think we need to think about what are the models that can best bring about the innovation. And Richard mentioned the telecom sector. Nobody was sitting around thinking when some of the major regulatory changes that were made to the telecom sector, won't it be great when the iPhone comes around? You won't believe what you'll be able to have in your hand and no one was thinking that. It just happened as a result of structural changes that allowed those innovations to be brought to consumers. I think focusing on a greater potential for customer choice, for customer education, for consumers to be able to make informed decisions is something that we really need to concentrate on. So much of what happens on the wholesale side right now is walled off from consumers ever being able to see it, being able to influence it, even know about it. And there are whole structures that are in place to prevent retail consumers from feeling what is going on the wholesale side. And so I think having greater consumer participation would be a great thing. And as Melissa mentioned, we're engaged in an effort right now with our Future Power Markets Forum to really focus on how it is that we can focus on market structures to incentivize and bring about a higher penetration of carbon-free energy into the market. And so we're trying to work on that, but of course there's a whole lot more to be done. And I'll stop there. Thank you again for the opportunity today.
Thank you, David. Appreciate those comments. And thank you to all of our speakers, Peter, Richard, Cheryl, and David, and Jason as well for your comments as we open this discussion. So again, for those watching online, my name is Melissa Lott, and I'm here with Dr. Peter Fox-Penner, David Hill, Richard Kaufman, and Cheryl LaFleur. And we're discussing the transition to low carbon power in the United States. So we're now going to move into a moderated discussion among our panelists, and then I will open it up for questions from the audience. Don't worry, we've been watching the questions as they come in, and we're going to see how many we can get through in the time that we have allowed. But for those of you joining us on Zoom, please remember that you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And for those of you watching the live stream anywhere else, you can submit a question via Twitter using hashtag CJEPLive and our Twitter handle at ColumbiaUEnergy. So I promised Peter that when we came back, to kick off the discussion, I'm wondering if there was one or maybe 2 points you wanted to quickly, share your thoughts on. Personally, I'm curious what everyone thinks about this federal policy. And David, you made the comment about waiting for it or not. This is This is a really important question, and I'm going to ask right before we pass it over to you, Peter, if Caitlin, you could bring up the responses to the second poll, and this will actually reinforce part of the reason why I'd like us to discuss this for a bit. If you look at this, we're talking around, and of course, these are folks who decided to attend this discussion today, so we are a bit self-selected. But if you look at the numbers, I mean, we're talking the vast majority, 3/4 of the group saying, we need to be decarbonizing the power sector by 2035, 99%, so not 100%, not 100% consensus, said by mid-century at the latest. So Peter, if you would, like to comment back on one or two of those items, and if you happen to weave federal policy into there, that would be great. And we'll go from there.
Thanks, Melissa. Yes, let me begin with the what's now known amongst us as the not waiting point. And I think that there's a significant overlap between David's very elegant and sophisticated comments and Cheryl's equally elegant and sophisticated comments, but both emphasizing that we have lots of institutions and lots of things underway. And Cheryl emphasized improving them and making better use of them. David sort of talked about the fact that he was skeptical of a grand bargain and that we shouldn't be waiting around for it, or a grand master plan, I think was his words. Let me say that I agree with at least half of that wholeheartedly. There is an enormous amount that we can do now with our current structures, and much of it is underway. It's astounding. Some of you saw Enel announced that it's going to put in 1 gigawatt of storage by 2023. NextEra announced that it was going to make hydrogen, green hydrogen with surplus power. I mean, I open up my trade publications every day and I see something that makes me say, wow. And I think that's fantastic. And I think the existing institutions could be strengthened. And most likely my pretty ambitious proposals in my book won't come to pass. And we will decarbonize the grid, and I'm convinced we will, without my ideas. I just think my ideas make it a little smoother and better. So yes to not waiting, yes to using the current institutions we have more. The part where I might just gently disagree is the skepticism of the grand master plan. And not that the grand master planning in the energy space has an unbelievably dismal record. There's a couple of pages in the book that review that very topic, quoting often Václav Smil, who many of you know is kind of like the dean of all energy experts worldwide. He and Amory Lovins are the guys I look to. And so that skepticism is warranted. I think this is an exception. I think that in the early days of the industry, we did grid planning and we did it well. Call it a master plan if you will, but we did it and it worked. Europe is doing it now, and believe it or not, it is something of a master plan. They are really doing it. They are building more better than we are building as a result of their plan, in my judgment. And I understand that in the American economy, just the whole American ideology, planning has really become viewed as something government does and never does well enough to make it worth its while, and that markets take care of things better. This makes me the heretic, but I think planning has worked and can work better, and the magic is not doing just one or the other, but I'm fully convinced that markets work much better if government does a certain amount of planning and a certain amount of adjudication of the markets, which takes me to the second point where I promised to be brief, and only the second one I'll mention, which relates to what Richard, who I also love like a brother, said. And this mirrors a lot of conversations we had.
But Peter, I'm not elegant and sophisticated.
No, but you're pretty darn smart. And smart and handsome, may I say. but I kind of, again, halfway, we halfway respectfully disagree on kind of our perspective. I do agree there is a vision for the retail electric utility as a platform on which mostly the markets provide most of the electricity services, and I mean all the electricity related services to customers. And there the regulator is, to use your term, much of a market arbiter. As you can see from what I wrote, that's a huge job, and it's very complex, and it will challenge the resources of public service commissions, something you and I have also talked about. But I think it is a direction that a state can go. I just don't think it's the only direction. You mentioned rate-based regulation leading to inefficiency. I think the key way to view the transition of regulation is that rate-based regulation was viewed as the core of what incentivized utilities and how regulation worked. In the PBR world that I envision, the return on invested capital is not the main driver, it's a constraint. PBR sets the incentives and the rewards and the basis for pricing. And you use prices to induce what you want the utility to do. And you check its return on capital as a constraint because of the way, the Hope decision and the way our Constitution's and run. So let me just leave it there. And I would love to respond in more depth to what you guys have said, but I would like also to hear from the audience and the questions, and to make this more of a discussion. And I want to say thank you to all you panelists. Those were generous and wise comments, even Richard's.
Thank you very much, Peter. Appreciate that. Cheryl, partially because, I mean, we've all been in DC at different times in our careers, but Cheryl, you spent a good amount of time there at FERC and in your work there. And I wonder if you could also speak about this federal policy question, which, came to the top of the polls.
Well, I agree with David's conclusion that we shouldn't wait for comprehensive legislation that has everything all straightened out before we start trying to solve this problem. Although I do think, everyone knows, even if the administration changes, battle lines will just be drawn in different places. There's only so much legislation you can get done. I put climate very high, but there's a lot of other priorities. And I think a solution, even if it were a compromise solution with the climate cautious that tried to bring along the states with extractive industries that oppose this, would be better than not having a federal law. But even without legislation, if we posit that won't get done, I think if the federal government just announced that we were rejoining Paris, we were going to try to address climate change, and got the agencies repopulated and working in the same direction. Just a few quick examples. The EPA has abandoned regulation of carbon dioxide, methane, mercury, and air toxics that under the Massachusetts versus EPA decision, that some of those things, methane and pipelines and all are an important part of this issue. The CEQ put out something that social cost of carbon was no longer $42. Now it was $6 because only carbon in the United States mattered. That changed a lot of the cost benefit of a lot of planning. You could have FERC using its authority to try to push the markets to adapt to state initiatives and try to consider climate in its decisions rather than pushing on the accelerator hard in the opposite direction. The land agencies, Interior, that have a lot to say about whether pump storage gets done, whether offshore wind gets done and on what time frame, whether transmission can be built across national parks even for a short span. If those were all at least rowing in the same direction, I think you could start to see some of the little underneath unsexy things go more easily. Without a big legislative, Federal Power Act version 2. So I do think having 70-something% of the population at least says they want to address climate change, having the US leadership say, yeah, we're part of the world and we're going to try to do this, would make a difference in all of those underneath ways, even without the master plan that we can't wait for.
Well, that introduces an interesting question that I think I'll put over to you first, Peter. How important are these global agreements like Paris, which, may be non-binding, but, signal an intention? How important is it that we're involved in those conversations, or should our focus be primarily at home and getting the federal or state-based conversations pushed over to accelerating this transition?
Well, the international agreements are absolutely critical. This is a global problem. It's fantasy to think that any one country can solve it. And in an era of trade tensions and international competition, it's suicidal to not create structures that will solve it together. So withdrawing from Paris was a suicidal act. And we need to get back into Paris and strengthen those agreements. And I know I'm echoing our colleague Jason, who's written about this in foreign policy quite recently. Well, do you want to go on and talk about equity? I saw that in the chat.
I do. Yeah, I'd like to make sure that we have time for that, if you don't mind. Just we have a few minutes here. And I want to make sure before we go to the open Q&A that we talk through that a bit. Because we did flag at a couple different points in this conversation, words like cost and how we pay for things, and fixed costs and variable costs, and focusing on kilowatt hours versus, okay, these, intensive capital investments that we need to make on the grid, et cetera. And I wonder if anyone would, I think I'm going to go to Richard first on this, and then David. And then if anybody else wants to get in on this question, we should talk about how do we make sure that as we transition, that this is a just and equitable transition, that I'm going to put it very ineloquently, but make sure that the people who can't afford to be paying more for their power bills, that are already on the edge or already in the classification of energy poverty, making decisions every month between paying rent, power, water, these types of things, that they don't end up in a even more difficult position. So Richard, we'll move to you first if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you. So, I think that's the path we're headed. We're headed on a path which is a path towards greater inequity, because it means that because the cost of distributed solutions, for example, are declining, it means that those companies or individuals that can afford their own energy system will do that, leaving the costs of the system to be borne over others that don't have that opportunity. And so Peter talked about microgrids as yet the latest example. And he also pointed out, and this is where we do agree, the distributed solutions almost always are of benefit to the host. The question is whether we can develop policies so that it's not just good for the host, but they're deployed in locations where it's good for all customers on the grid. And so that leads to a bunch of questions about pricing of distributed solutions, depending on where they are. I think that the other question about equity, again, goes to this point about the how financially inefficient the system is. And as one measure is low average capacity utilization. And so that means that there's a lot of idle capital, arguably more capital than is needed. And if we keep rebuilding the system and adding more renewables and have all this extra redundancy, that average capacity utilization is going to get worse, and that means that it's going to be borne disproportionately by and the rates go up. That's effectively that's going to have a greater burden on lower income customers. And to the degree to which, and this will be the last thing I'm going to say, to the degree to which that we continue to look to surcharges to finance clean energy, as opposed to trying to figure out how to use the cost envelope of the bill more effectively, again, that's an effective regressive tax.
Thank you for that, Richard. We have a whole host, and you just brought up a couple questions, but Peter, did you want to touch on the equity conversation?
Yes, I don't know if David wanted to comment on it. You mentioned him, but David, do you want to comment on that first? Or?
No, the only thing I say no, and then I proceed to comment. The only thing I will say is that I 100% agree that equity in terms of who is paying for everything is an extraordinarily important consideration, and one that often is overlooked as we concentrate on other things and then think about, well, who is actually paying? Should they be paying? Do they want to be paying? And that we really need to think very carefully about that, both on the wholesale level, but particularly on for the retail end use customers.
Thank you, David. I have a couple of things to say on equity, if you'll bear with me. I think they're quite important. I think this is a very, very important issue. First of all, just from a factual basis, the share of the average American's wallet or household budget going to electricity is pretty much at its lowest point in history. Electricity is cheap, maybe too cheap. Makes us overuse it, as I mentioned earlier. Fortunately, we're offsetting that with energy efficiency. So there's two fears, shibboleths, I think, that are raised in this transition. And maybe I shouldn't call them shibboleths because they're legitimate fears. One of them is that decarbonization itself, the enterprise of decarbonization, is going to drive electricity rates up. And there is a tremendous amount of modeling. Most recently, the Lawrence Berkeley study on getting to 80% carbon reductions, or rather to 90% by 2035. And all of the modeling shows that for the first, what I would call the first wave of decarbonization, to get the grid down by 70 or 80%, there is no reason for electricity rates to go up significantly from where they are. They might go up a little bit, but it's going to be rounding error compared to the other things that drive American households and, frankly, American poverty, namely healthcare and housing costs. And any of you who haven't read this fantastic book by Nobel laureate Angus Deaton and his wife Ann Case, here I am recommending another book, my book talk. It's called Deaths of Despair. And it is a fantastic book about the penalty that American healthcare is taking on American families. So so I don't think decarbonization itself is a big threat to the incomes and livelihoods of our customers. The second threat, I think, is much bigger, and Richard and I both mentioned it, and that is the shift from what I call the fragmentation. Currently, electricity use is, and I know people will not, or some people will not like this analogy, but we have essentially in every electric utility service area a single payer electricity system. That's kind of what it is. And it pools we all get used, we get universal service, that's enforced, and we control how much people pay. That has allowed us to keep electricity cheaper and to do things like shutoffs, moratoria on shutoffs for low-income customers during the pandemic. If there is too much customer defection, if we don't manage that, if we don't manage people's building microgrids, then I completely agree with Richard that the benefits will overwhelmingly flow to wealthier industries and wealthier families. And that is, I fear that much more than decarbonization. Two more things that I think are important about equity. One of them is that the decarbonization of the power grid and the economy as a whole is going to be a gigantic investment program. That's just an economic fact. We're taking a bunch of capital and we have to replace it with other capital, hopefully more higher utilized, Richard. And that's going to create jobs. It really is. One of the essential foundations of the clean energy transition is that we need to prioritize getting those jobs to disadvantaged, underrepresented communities and to the fossil fuel workers who are displaced. And there are lots and lots of programs to do that, whether it's training oil rig workers to work on wind turbines, or at Roxbury Community College, just down the street from my institute in Boston, there's a brand new course to teach students how to become smart building engineers. And they have kits and labs, and they walk out of there, and they could be hired by David's former company or any of many, many other smart building folks. The third point is that we have to recognize that part of the solution to making decarbonization equitable is making the overall American economy more equitable. A lot of what is wrong with why people can't afford electricity is fairly considered to be housing policy. And if you think the United States has a weak or non-existent national energy policy, take a look at our weak to non-existent national housing policy. We have at least 20 million homes short. That forces costs way up. And it's really housing costs and healthcare costs that are just criminally punishing, I think, low-income Americans. So part of the solution has to be beyond the borders of our industry and decarbonization, as important as our focus is. So thanks for letting me get all that out off my chest, you might say.
This is fantastic. I am already regretting that we do not have more than 90 minutes, but I knew that would be the case. And thank you for flagging that. One thing I would say quickly, just for those in the audience, is that the Center on Global Energy Policy, we're going to be hosting a 3-part series talking about energy and environmental justice. And the first one talks about energy, climate, and health, focusing on air pollution. The second one is around buildings and housing, which Richard will be moderating. And the third one will be focusing in on the power sector, which Cheryl will be moderating. So just wanted to flag that coming up in the fall. So we have a bunch of questions here that I want to move to and see how many we can get in. So I'm going to try to group a bunch together. We keep seeing RTOs coming up, lots of different questions around them in the questions. And I'm going to focus in on Matt Wittenstein's question. Matt, good to see you online. Thanks for joining us. He asked, what is your view on California ISO's proposed extended day-ahead market for the Western Interconnect? Is it an alternative to a Western RTO, a stepping stone to one, a detour, et cetera? And I'm going to start with Cheryl to comment on that. And then if we want to broaden it up at all around the RTO discussion, we'll go from there.
Okay, thank you. I will try to answer Matthew's question and one other RTO, a couple other real quick RTO questions very rapidly. As far as the Western EDAM market, which I remember as being like the cheese, EDAM, I don't know if it's a stepping stone or an alternative to an RTO, but I strongly believe, and I believed when I was at FERC, that the best thing is to let them decide and not kind of say, oh, great, now you're almost an RTO, because it's developed organically in the region, as is the now very embryonic Southeastern day-ahead trading market. And I think it's all to the good if we allow people to regionalize in different ways. So I'd love to see it develop, you know, from a imbalanced market to a day ahead to something stronger. But even if it stays at one of those stops, it's still a big improvement in utilizing resources over a broader geography, which is especially needed in the West. Another question was like, am I worried about the differences between, we worry so much about the RTOs and the non-RTO regions when it comes to regional policy? And the answer is yes. Every time FERC upped the ante and required another thing for the RTOs to change their tariff in a slightly different way, I worried we were creating more and more of a divide between the two different, you know, Americas in the organized markets and in the bilateral markets. And that's why I think Order 1000 had the right idea to require it even in non-organized and bilateral regions of the country, although a lot more has to be done. And I'll quickly take one other question was, do we think the capacity factors will get better and plants will be used more as we decarbonize? No, I think in the short run it'll get worse, because we're encouraging people to build renewables with tax policy and state requirements, whether they're tied to the demand and when the peaks are or not. And so that the renewables are being built regardless of their exact fit to the load shapes. And the balancing resources that we need to retain or develop will be sitting around an awful lot of empty time while they wait for the ramp, while they wait for the duck's neck or whatever part of the duck it is when power comes up again, and not use the rest of the time. So I think with working toward decarbonization, we're actually setting up having a lot of resources that aren't used all the time. But after the things get built, that's why I think you need a market or an integrator to help them be used in the most efficient way, so we don't just have a lot of stuff sitting around that was paid for by someone hardly being used at all, and we keep building more. So I think that's the power of markets and regional integrators. But I think right now we're just building a lot of stuff that we are not thinking through how it fits with what we have, and the the balancing resources are getting used less and less, but they're super necessary when you need them. So we need to keep them around. Kind of rapid
Thank you for
fire
that,
answer.
Cheryl. Appreciate it. I'm going to change, I guess, gears a little bit and go to, on our first poll, what were the third and fourth buckets, largely around technology. We're going to have to build a whole lot of new stuff that produces power without all the emissions that we don't want or captures it. So we have a couple of different questions I'm going to try to push all together. One comes from Clifford Krause, another from Juho, former colleague at the IEA who headed up the CCS unit there. So Clifford's question is around hydrogen. I'm going to put that with the CCS question, and I'm also going to throw nuclear in the mix. And I'd appreciate if we could comment on all these. Thinking about it broadly as being both, Peter, what you spoke around baseload power supplies and seasonal storage. How are we going to be producing hydrogen in the future? And what is going to happen when it comes to fossil fuels with CCS or CCUS? Pick which one you think is going to be most successful in the future. And then what are we going to do with our nuclear power plants? Do we continue to retire them? Are we going to invest in them? And if we are going to invest in them, how do we make that happen?
I guess if I get to go first, which I appreciate, well, I would like to see nuclear plants continue as long as they are safe. They're a huge chunk of our zero carbon supply now, and we need to get the rest of it built. They're going to retire sooner or later, and the only nuclear that looks to me like it's maybe economically viable is the advanced modular reactors. I hope they become viable. They're flexible and adjustable, and so they can provide balancing power. They're also at a reasonable size and scale. But there's a long way to go. I mean, if we're talking about trying to get to a zero grid by 2035, as your polling indicated, I'll be surprised if any of them are working in 2035. I hope so. I just don't know. CCUS, you know, you have one of the world's authority right there at CEJA, Julio Friedman. I follow him and several other folks on it, but I think it is making enormous progress. I just saw a statistic, there's 600 CCUS or CCS projects working around the world. And that's much more than I think most of us realize. And I think utilization of carbon is just in its infancy. I think that's going to have enormous promise in decarbonizing industry and industrial materials, whether it's cement or steel or other things. Finally, really briefly on hydrogen, I think it has an important future. You just saw NextEra announced that we'll use surplus renewables to generate green hydrogen in Florida. I think we're going to see much more of that. As I mentioned, one of the reasons why I think that regional energy planning is needed is that there's going to be trade-offs between making hydrogen, making other zero carbon fuels, and making electricity, and where you make it and where you ship it and how you ship it. And I don't think markets are good for sorting out those questions, but I think hydrogen will have a role. I hope that's helpful.
Could I jump in on the hydrogen bit? Because I just want to talk about sort of state policy innovation for a second and look to what happened in the eastern states with the development of offshore wind, which I think is a pretty big breakthrough and what looks like no time to have major commitments that have been made to that industry at pretty attractive costs. And I think that has to do with the increased understanding now, finally, that by creating a large economic prize, by states acting to create an end market, it draws in capital and investment, which can lower costs. And so I think we could imagine that same thing occurring with hydrogen. So we could imagine states getting together just in the way that they got together with offshore wind and deciding that they're going to establish a small hydrogen standard into the gas pipeline. It wouldn't cost customers very much, but that would increase over time, and with scale, costs would decline, and that would create, again, enough of a certain end market that I think would draw on more capital and reduce costs. So, I see a path towards deployment And it would pick up Peter's idea of more regional cooperation.
Thanks, Richard. And Cheryl, I don't know if you want to make any comments on the nuclear part of that question.
Well, I just wanted to add a little bit to what Peter said. I consider the big nuclear units, well, they're mostly all big, they're in the same category of large hydro. Big stuff that's important to the United States that you couldn't build today. And so, although you can still build hydro in Canada, and they're building wires to bring it down every place they can profitably do so, but it's very, very hard to build big new hydro. I walked around Grand Coulee Dam and thought, can you imagine the environmental impact statement if you did this in 2010 or whenever I was there? And I look at nukes the same way. It's just almost impossible, if you look at how much it's cost to build Vogtle and all, to get somebody to actually build a big new one. So I think it's important to, they have a huge role on the system now and maximize and keep them safe if we can. But I think that's not the future. That's, if you will, that's the bridge fuel, the big central station stuff that's just very hard to build. As far as small modular, geez, I'd love to see it come in, but if I was allowed to invest in energy stuff, which I'm not, I would not take my money, my retirement fund, and bet on that coming. I just think there's a lot of other technologies coming a lot faster.
Many thanks for that. And we have a few different questions. We're going to try to get a couple more in very quickly. One from Bob Wyman. Bob submitted a couple questions, but I'll focus on this one about the electrification of heating. His question is talking about electrifying heating, so electrifying end uses. Peter, I'm going to send this to you first. And the concern that will create hundreds of billions of dollars of stranded assets in gas distribution utilities throughout the system. How will we recover that cost? Who will pay for these things? I think broadly, this is an interesting stranded assets question, if you don't mind touching on it.
I think it's one of the most important questions. Thank you for asking it, Bob. I think it's one of the most important questions confronting the energy sector, I'll just say. I don't know the answer to it, but I have a few thoughts about the direction to go in. First of all, it is very difficult to decarbonize heating, and it is a long-term proposition to switch out the heating systems and really all the gas end use technologies, which are quite scattered and distributed, so that as we profile down gas use, it's not going to go away anywhere near overnight, which is to say there is still a long remaining lifetime on gas distribution facilities. I think building new ones is a very difficult proposition. And we saw some pipeline cancellations, I think, for that reason. So part of the answer, I think, is amortizing these systems over their existing lifetime, but making sure that we manage that. The other thing that I think we need to look at very hard, and there's interesting experiments going on in Europe, at least one in Sweden and one in England. And that is converting at least part of the gas distribution system to another carbon-free fuel, whether that's renewable natural gas or hydrogen. And I think that is the second part of the solution to try and keep stranded asset costs down and make this a very manageable transition.
Thank you very much. I would love to punt some more questions around the group, but unfortunately we have just hit time. So I wanted to say thank you again for all of our speakers. It's been a real pleasure and a joy, honestly, to have this discussion today. And thank you all for taking the time. Thanks also to our events team, led by Ms. Caitlin Norfleet, for all of their efforts to make this whole thing run smoothly so we can focus on the discussion and the substance. I really appreciate that. I just wanted to do a quick announcement. Next week on August 4th from 12:30 to 2 p.m. Eastern, we're going to be hosting an event that touches on some different aspects of the nuclear question, specifically talking about a new report out by our colleague Matt Bowen at the Center on Global Energy Policy, focused on past, present, and future nuclear energy cooperation between U.S. and its allies. So picking up on some of this international cooperation discussion and the nuclear question. Just want to say thank you again. As we mentioned, the full video recording of this event will be available on our website in a few days. And thank you again to everyone who joined, including the hundreds of our audience members with your great questions. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Stay healthy, stay safe. Thank you so much.